Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by Emmy award-winning investigative journalists, Earth Files reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe, and world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham-Bentwaters incident, John Burroughs. And now, leading off tonight's program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
A century ago, in 1919, a book was published entitled The Book of the Damned, meaning we humans who are being deliberately kept from the truth about where we came from and why we exist. The author was Charles Fort, whose Fortean times and books are now legendary for his lifelong effort to learn and report about what was behind the UFO phenomena and other Earth mysteries that haunt this planet. In the Book of the Damned, Charles Fort wrote, quote, "I think we are property. I should say we belong to something. That once upon a time this earth was no man's land, that other worlds explored and colonized here and fought among themselves for possession. But now it's owned by something. That something owns this earth, all others warned off. That all this has been known perhaps for ages to certain ones upon this earth. A cult or order, members of which function like bellwethers to the rest of us, or overseers directing us in accordance with instructions received from somewhere else in our mysterious usefulness," close quote. Another investigator of strange phenomena and their relationship to our ancient past, present, and future is our guest today on Phenomenon Radio. Jim Marrs has been trying for a long time to understand who or what that something is that appears to own and control Earth and humanity's mysterious usefulness. Jim was born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas. He has been tracking down facts and trying to make sense of political events in America since his college days as a journalism major at the University of North Texas in Denton. He graduated in 1966 and began a newspaper reporting and editing career, first at the Denton Record Chronicle and then the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. Later, at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, he was an investigative reporter and cartoonist and earned photography awards. By 1988, Jim Marrs decided to dig into his big file about President John F. Kennedy's assassination, in which Jim saw disturbing links to the UFO phenomena. The result was an instant classic called Crossfire. 2 months after its release in 1989, Jim received a call from Hollywood film director Oliver Stone, who wanted to option Crossfire for the Hollywood movie that became JFK. By that time, Jim Marrs began asking book editors and others what each thought was the next big, dark, secret government cover-up beyond the JFK assassination. Unanimously, the answer was UFOs, a theme that has continued to thread its way through several of his important books, including Alien Agenda, Investigating the Extraterrestrial Presence Among Us, Rule by Secrecy, and Our Occulted History. Do the Global Elite Conceal Ancient Aliens? That question about who exactly is the Earth's 1% controlling elite was in his mind as Jim wrote his most recent book to be released in spring 2017, entitled Shadows of the Illuminati. Jim writes about the secret societies that have emerged in this world claiming to have other knowledge about secret truths. Echoing Charles Fort, Jim concludes, quote, "There appears to be something darker behind the effort to subjugate humanity and wreck the environment than simple corporate greediness or political power grabs. If the accounts of the Anunnaki sky gods are in any way truthful, then early humans were ruled over by extraterrestrial astronauts, and someone has been with us all through recorded history to this day, close quote. After this short break, Jim joins us on Phenomenon Radio to look at the most recent geopolitical territorial landscape after the controversial U.S. presidential election, his perspective about President Trump's recent decision to take the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff off the National Security Council, and the control system of Earth that goes back at least 5,000 years to the Anunnaki, who were never gods.
You're locked into Phenomenon Radio Live on KGRA DB with Bentwater's experiencer John Burroughs and Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist and Earth Files reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe. Tonight's special guest Jim Marrs will join the show right after these messages. Stay with us. PatriotPrepared.com carries the leading brands of storable food from Numana, Legacy, and Heaven's Harvest. Patriot Prepared. Our name says it all. We're dedicated to empowering you to be self-reliant and confident in any circumstance. Whether you want to be prepared in the event of an emergency or you're an outdoor sports enthusiast, PatriotPrepared.com has prepackaged meals and kits for your entire family. Legacy, Heaven's Harvest, and Numana are known for high-quality, great-tasting GMO-free, nutritious food with no chemical preservatives. Simple to prepare, easy to store, gluten-free and organic high-quality nutrition options with a 25-year shelf life. You can't beat the feeling of being food secure when you need it most. So go to PatriotPrepared.com right now to pick up your supply of high-quality storable food for your family, because it makes good sense to be prepared. That's PatriotPrepared.com.
Your best source for live UFO paranormal talk radio. KGRAradio.com.
Thanks for joining us tonight for the Phenomenon Radio program with our very special guest, Jim Marrs. To start tonight's interview, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Hey, Jim, welcome back to Phenomenon Radio. It is great to have you here.
Well, it's always fun to be with you, Linda, in our never-ending search for intelligent life on the planet Earth.
It's true. For decades and decades, centuries and centuries. And our big question today is about control systems that influence humans who are unaware that we are mysteriously useful, as you write in your new book, to something that claims us as property. And Jim, through that lens of today linked to the ancient past, could you begin with the current agitated political scene and what your reaction is to new President Trump taking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff out of the National Security Council and putting his White House chief strategist, Steve Bannon of Breitbart, in the NSC?
Well, you have to understand, I look at this past election as not so much an election as a referendum. It was a referendum on the New World Order, okay? Do we want to continue to march down this path that both the Bushes and the Clintons put us on for a one-world socialist government, one world monetary system, or do we want to retain a little bit of our sovereignty so that we can support the idea of individual freedom and liberty? And you see the result, okay? The people say, no, that's enough. We've had enough. We want to go down a different path. And so now we see it beginning to happen. They're changing everything up. They're shaking up the establishment. Just a couple of days before the election, Trump in Florida, before an audience, said, our campaign is an existential threat to the establishment. And it was. And the popular vote showed, the electoral college vote, the majority of states say, yeah, we want something different. So we're getting something different. Now, whether this is going to be for better or for worse just remains to be seen.
Well, Jim, if you look up the word Illuminati in dictionaries, encyclopedias, the web, you get a definition that May 1st, 1776, that the Bavarian Illuminati was organized. And I immediately, looking at that date, thought, is there a direct link from that Bavarian Illuminati to the July 4th, 1776 creation of the U.S.?
Yes, there is. And first, you have to understand that the Declaration of Independence was not necessarily signed on July the 4th, 1776. It was a several month-long process. So they signed a little here and they signed a little there, and they did a little of this and a little of that. And it really is absolutely fascinating that this 1776 date has become so prominent because, in my mind, and once you look at all of the evidence and facts available, it does seem to be that there is a tie-in because even the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they all wrote about the Illuminati. And whether they were members or not, I guess we'll never know, but they certainly were aware of it. I know George Washington in a letter said no one is more secure in the fact that the Illuminati was operating here in North America than I am. All right. So, in fact, some were even accusing Thomas Jefferson of being a member of the Illuminati. And it's true that he wrote some fairly supportive statements for Adam Weishaupt, who founded the Illuminati. And keep in mind that it was only less than 10 years after the American Revolution that we had the French Revolution, and there's tons of evidence showing the involvement of Illuminized or Freemason lodges who were behind the French Revolution and that had been infiltrated, indoctrinated with the Illuminati philosophies.
Well, what confuses me is the issue of who is positive and who is negative, because the waters are very muddy. If you go back to what is quoted from May 1st, 1776, with the creation of the Bavarian Illuminati, they said, quote, "The order of the day is to put an end to the machinations of the purveyors of injustice, to control them without dominating them." So their argument was that there was injustice on the earth and that they, illumined by, and we are implying in this show today that illumination is from the control system, the other, the intelligence, the alien presence. And then when you pull the camera back from that and you say, well, the United States was founded by Thomas Jefferson wrote about this, and I saw it in an encyclopedia, that there was a figure wearing a dark cloak that came into the garden where Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence. And he said this being without introduction laid down in front of him the 13-layered pyramid with the eye at the top and said, "This will be the symbol of your nation." Now, if that has been going on behind the scenes of the creation of this country, then isn't the entire founding of the United States of America by Illuminati figures who were trying to counter injustices and corruption and greed?
Right. Well, this is what got the Illuminati in trouble in the first place, is that when they first came into being, you have to understand this was a group of highly educated, very sophisticated German intellectuals, okay? And they were making a very, very detailed and in-depth study of ancient mythologies and philosophies they studied carefully the information brought back from the Middle East by the Knights Templars. They were a direct offshoot of the Knights Templars, and then the Templars go back. They brought back information gleaned from Solomon's treasure. Solomon's treasure was an accumulation of information technology based on the evolution of several civilizations, beginning with Sumer, Sumer, which was the world's first greatest civilization. The technology and the sophistication of Sumer was then transferred down through a series of civilizations: the Assyrians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and we tend to think of these as separate civilizations, but actually they were just a devolation of the original Sumer. And then the technology and knowledge of Sumer was carried over to Egypt by the biblical patriarch Abraham, or Abram. Who, all you have to do is read the Bible. It says he came from Ur of Chaldea. Well, Ur was one of the southern Mesopotamian cities of the Sumerian Empire, and Mesopotamia and Chaldea was simply a older term for Mesopotamia, or what is now Iraq, the center of the Sumerian civilization. Now, the reason the Sumerian civilization is so important to us is because, unlike the Greeks and the Romans, who left behind papyrus and paper that was subject to, to deterioration and ruin from water and floods and war and fire, the Sumerians wrote their information down in cuneiform tablets that were mud, and then they would bake them, and then they'd turn to stone. And so these are still in existence, and they're stashed away in the basements of libraries all around the world. Unfortunately, only about 20% of them have been translated. But the ones that have been translated tell us that 300,000 years ago, the Anunnaki arrived. Well, the Anunnaki translate as those who came from the heavens, landed on the earth. And it was from the Anunnaki that the Sumerians were taught all the basics of civilization, astronomy and law, even down to how to brew beer. The Kinzazi was the goddess of fermentation for the Anunnaki, and it was stated in the tablets that she was the daughter of Enki, one of the chief Anunnaki gods, if you will. Except what's interesting is that when they wrote about this in these tablets, they did not call them gods. They just were the Anunnaki. What's happened is that in the 1800s, when it was suddenly discovered, these mounds in Iraq, and they began to excavate them, and they found out there was a whole buried civilization there. And this is when they first became aware of the Sumerian civilization. And they would read, once they were able to translate their tablets, they were reading about the Anunnaki, who could fly through the air, who could alter DNA, knew about in vitro fertilization, all of this stuff, which back in the 1800s, they didn't have a clue what they were even talking about. They didn't know about atoms. They didn't know about space flight. They didn't even know about heavier than air flight. They thought it was impossible. So all of this was just chalked up to some mythology. Except what's happening now is nobody's really arguing with the translations. It's the argument with the interpretation, because a growing number of scholars are now saying, well, look, maybe these folks were not just writing down flaky stories that they were making up out of whole cloth. Maybe they were actually putting down what they knew to be the truth. And if that's the case, then we have this historical record of involvement by non-human intelligences back in the earliest days of our history.
And Jim, if I'm remembering correctly, from Rule by Secrecy, which is complementing your Shadows of the Illuminati in many ways, that the entire Anunnaki bloodline that would have led to Abraham leads to the question, was Abraham a full-blood Anunnaki, a hybrid, or what do you think that whole, we'll call it historic line of figures, were they actually still Anunnaki present on the earth?
Yes, I think just from everything I know, I think Abraham probably was a hybrid. He was a cross between the humans and the Anunnaki, but he was given great status because he was a pretty sharp guy, and he was not just a Semite dragging his tent around on the sand. Abraham was a high-ranking and very elevated official there in Chaldea, and the cities, Uruk and Ur, and other cities there of the Mesopotamian, of the Sumerian Empire, they were named after his relatives. So he apparently had royal blood, which means he was probably connected to the Anunnaki. And don't forget that in the Old Testament we have this account of his sons coming in and finding him naked in his tent or whatever, and there's a big hoodoo about that. Okay, that doesn't make any sense at all. If they were a bunch of just primitive people living in tents out in the desert, you know that nudity was no big deal to them. So the fact that they made a big issue out of this tends to indicate that there was something physically about Abraham that apparently could have caused some consternation among the regular humans.
And you and I have talked about it being scales from other pieces of information, and that there would have been some sort of reptilian humanoid bloodline with the Anunnaki or something else. And Jim, can you explain for the phenomenal audience that link between that time of Abraham, the Merovingians, what you know about the Merovingians that gets us up to France, Rennes le Chateau, the Rothschilds, Hitler, World War II, and jumping to today, where we sort of started about what the very chaotic, seemingly, would just say that this is a unsettled political time in the United States, and we're trying to look at this lens of what was the past really, and what could today's link be to that. So could you go to Abraham and the Merovingian bloodline all the way up?
Well, let me quote from Manly P. Hall, who is a very ranking occultist and a very ranking Freemason. And he wrote in his little treatise called The Coming of the Mystery Schools, he said, in the remote past, the gods walked with men. They chose from among the sons of men the wisest and the truest, and these they labored with, preparing them to carry on the work of the gods after the spiritual hierarchies themselves had withdrawn into the invisible worlds. With these specially ordained and illumined sons, they left the keys of their great wisdom. These illumined ones founded what we now know as the ancient mysteries. Okay, so we go back and we assume that the tablets of the Sumerians are true and correct, and that these Anunnaki were here on the earth thousands of years ago, teaching primitive humans how to be civilized. Okay, now this knowledge then was passed down through the priesthoods and through the people who were actually having direct contact with these the flying gods of the Old Testament and of the ancient writings. But as they began to withdraw, see, they left behind the people with bits and pieces of the knowledge. And of course, it's like the old parlor game where you get 10 people standing in a row and the first person whispers a declarative sentence in the ear of the next one and they pass it on down. And by the time they get to the 10th person, it rarely ever sounds like the original statement, because things get garbled as we pass information along from not only person to person, but from city state and empire to empire. And so this was the connecting cord. This was the connecting tissue that took some of this knowledge of the ancient astronauts, brought it forward through the mystery schools of Egypt and then Greece, and then was picked up by the Knights Templars when they were operating in Jerusalem. They picked up a lot from Solomon's treasure. Solomon, of course, built the temple and stored all of this information because the Israelites had been traveling 40 years in the desert, and they weren't just walking around. They were attacking and defeating one little city state after another. And after they would defeat one of these cities, the normal practice is that the victors, got the spoils, and they went in and took all the gold and silver and all the stuff that was worth in pieces of the Anunnaki knowledge. And this was all passed along. It was stored in Solomon's temple. And then the temple was destroyed. And when the Romans came and invaded Palestine, that would have been around I think 70 AD. And so they knew, the Israelites knew that the Roman army was coming, so they hid the treasure away and buried it under what used to be the Temple of Solomon, and by then had become the palace of Herod the king. And when the Romans took over, they found a portion of the treasure. They couldn't take it all away, or they'd realize it was gone, and the Romans would keep searching for it. So they left behind maybe a good portion of the treasure, but not the important stuff. Important stuff was sealed away in sealed rooms down beneath the temple of Herod, and but the Knights Templars, when they gained control over Jerusalem, kind of had word of this. They knew there was something down there, and they went down and excavated, and they recovered a lot of this treasure and sent it back to Rome. 400 years later, Alaric the Goth sacked Rome. He got hold of this same treasure, not only gold and silver and precious stones, but also knowledge, bits of information and knowledge passed down from the Anunnaki. This also told them that the rest of the treasure was still over there in Jerusalem, and that's what caused these Merovingians and the people there in southern France to mount the First Crusade. It was to go back over there and try to recover the rest of the treasure, which they did. And in the process, they formed the Poor Knights of the Temple, which became the Knights Templars. And they grew rich and powerful until a French king and the Pope decided they were getting too powerful. And in 1307, they passed a law against them, said they're outlawed and they're heretics and they need to be destroyed. And they actually were burning some of them at the stake. Because it was all just petty rivalry, and this has been what's going on ever since. Now, the Illuminati in Germany in 1776 had gone back and studied all of this and had followed this trail just like I have, just like I'm outlining to you, and they decided that the current situation there in Europe, where the kings were in charge and the Pope was really in charge because it was the Catholic Church that dominated everyone's life and was lending gold and silver to the kings and queens, had control over them through their priest in every little town and village that everybody would confess to. Early day NSA, they knew everything that was going on with everybody, and they were in charge, and they became corrupt. When the Illuminati came along, I think they started off as clerics, okay, because Bavaria, for example, was a hotbed of Jesuit activity. And the Jesuits are pretty interesting because they were the SS of the Catholic Church. They'd been having problems with Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation and a few other little things, and so they decided they needed a protective force. So they got some of the best and brightest, and created the Jesuits. Well, the Jesuits were the best and the brightest, and they began to look at church dogma and church philosophy and policies, and they're going, this isn't exactly right, and it doesn't necessarily even jive with what's in the Bible, and so they began to have some mount a dissident reaction to the church and to the state, and that bled over into the Illuminati, who decided the biggest problems going were the church and the state, and they were all, of course, needless to say, hooked together. And so when it became obvious to the ruling authorities that the Illuminati had decided that basically they wanted to be anarchist, I guess they didn't want the state and the church to be running everybody's lives. Well, then of course that was a threat to the establishment, and they outlawed the Illuminati, and therefore today I think it's safe to say there is no Illuminati as a functional, organization. But the philosophy of the Illuminati, which I call Illuminism, okay, is another ism, just like capitalism and communism and Nazism and feminism and you name it. It's another ism. It's a philosophy that you can get behind. And so today, yes, the Illuminati still lives on, but only its shadow, because we don't have a definitely organized group, but what we have are individuals and groups and secret societies around the world who are practicing Illuminati philosophy, which comes down to, and this is where it gets kind of creepy, their basic philosophy is the end justifies the means. So in other words, if you feel like your purpose, your goal, your agenda is worthwhile, then anything you can do to further it is okay, including murder and lying, deceit, pretend to be something you're not, blah, blah, blah. And now, once you understand that philosophy, then you understand a lot about what's happening in the United States today. Over the past several decades, you vote for a Republican and nothing changes. You vote for a Democrat, nothing changes. And that's because the Illuminati, philosophy at the heart of some of those people, just continues on. In my book, I make the statement that you could empty the pockets of Hillary Clinton and Dick Cheney, and you're not going to find a membership card in the Illuminati, and yet both of those individuals practice Illuminati philosophy. The end justifies the means.
Jim, I'd like to go now back to the present. Obviously, the past can control the future, or present or future. But here's my question. Okay, Trump comes into office. He makes some changes, on the national, as far as the National Intelligence Committee. Okay, he takes off the Joint Chief of Staff except when they need to brief. Puts Bannon in there. But going back to last summer, I believe it was right after the nomination. Maybe it was right before. Newt Gingrich, who has been highly influential in Trump's campaign, then the transition team, actually was being possibly considered for the member of a cabinet position or a high advisor. He made a statement on Fox to Bill O'Reilly that a lot of people probably aren't even aware of. But O'Reilly asked him a direct question. He said, "Why are the elite afraid of Trump?" And he said, "Well, he hasn't been read into the club yet. He not a member of the secret society." He said it exactly like that. He's not a member of the secret society. And he said, until he is, they're not going to trust him, basically. So if Newt Gingrich is involved with Trump right now, if Trump is reaching back out to the UK which you go back to the UK, is they're highly influential in our financial district as far as, and everyone knows money controls everything.
Right.
How is Trump any different than, even though he shook some things up and he's trying to bring us back more, homegrown, but still, how is he going to be any different than any of these other presidents, other than he's willing to shake things up and he's come in as a non-politician? But isn't that maybe what they figured they needed, just because of the fact that people were just sick of nothing getting done? So let somebody come in and appear to look like they're shaking things up?
Well, that's been the whole question all along. Going back to when his name first popped up as a potential presidential candidate, I thought, okay, wow, they're just putting in this ringer. They just set him up as a straw man to make it appear that we had a choice. Okay, and then as it rolled along, all of a sudden he's the strong guy, and some of the Republican candidates who probably would have been perfectly acceptable to the New World Order, and they're dropping by the wayside. So yeah, it's kind of a conundrum. I suspect, because of some things he said, I know when Trump was traveling in the Midwest, he made a talk and he said, I'm a New Yorker, and I think like a New Yorker, and I grew up in New York. He says, but since I've started this campaign, I suddenly realized that there's a lot of Americans out here, and they have different problems, and they have different interests, and they need somebody to represent them. So I took that to mean perhaps he had an epiphany as he was going along the road to the presidential nomination, and he may have actually begun to realize, well, maybe I could be president, and maybe I can do something. I see a lot of parallels with John F. Kennedy, who was a dark horse. Nobody thought much about him. Rich man's son, blah, blah. And yet he suddenly found his way to the national stage, and he began to take steps that was in the benefit of the public of this country. He was not going to put us into a prolonged war in Vietnam with ground combat troops. He was prosecuting organized crime as never before or since. He was closing the tax loopholes for the giant multinational corporations. He was even talking about reducing the power of the Federal Reserve System, which is, of course, a private banking cartel that dominates our economy and has since it was hurriedly passed on a Christmas Eve in 1913 and nobody watching. And so I see the same thing going on here now. But when it gets but you can't pay any attention to what anybody says. Don't listen to what Trump says. Don't listen to what the mass media says, especially the mass media. I think they've proved themselves during this past election that at best they're out of touch with the people, and at worst they're nothing but just a propaganda mouthpiece for the party and the secret societies that are trying to run this country. So So don't listen to anything anybody says, but watch what they do. And this is what's happening right now. We're watching him shake things up. We don't know if this is going to be really for the betterment or for the worse, but it's definitely going to be different. And we have to, I think, give it a few more months, watch how this shakes out, and before we can know for sure whether Trump is truly a loose cannon or whether he's simply firing shots that have been called a long time ago by the ruling elite. And there's really no question about that. We know from a study that was done by the French, not French, the Swiss study that was done just a couple of years ago, and they found that they studied 43,000 multinational corporations and found that they all devolved down to about 1,000. That 1,000 boils down to about 400. That 400, because of cross ownership and directorship, is actually controlled by about 20 banks. Okay, so in other words, a handful of people who control about 20 banks basically control the economy of the world. And this was been substantiated. So there's no question that there's a small clique of people trying to run the world. Okay?
Well, it doesn't, Jim, and I have a question. Doesn't that lead back to the UK? because the banking system and everything basically
Yes.
is controlled through the UK. So what I'm saying is Trump's reached out back out. Obama pushed away from the UK and in fact wanted to, globalization. Trump immediately has reached back out to the UK, and even after he did this immigration policy, which the country themselves over there are against, which is funny because they actually exited Brexit because of that problem. The
Yeah.
people over there voted to come out of out of the EU because of no, they voted to come out of the EU because of the immigration problem. But when Trump is cracking down on immigration, now they're up in arms and saying that the prime minister shouldn't visit with him, but he's reaching out back to the UK. But one of the things else I'm curious about is they always say when the president comes in, he gets read in completely. And part of the reading in is the Illuminatus or the power people, whether or not they brief him directly or the intelligence agencies, which very well are run or influenced by him, brief him on that particular portion of it. So is, in your opinion, and I'm just curious, I know it's early, but is what he doing on the surface now just trying to appease the people that were so upset and they're venting and they're letting some of the steam come out, or and then he's going to get taken down one way or another, because if he's really not going to play with these rich people,
Yeah.
Whether or not they're from somewhere else, their bloodline or whatever, they're not going to allow this to go on. I mean, look what happened to Kennedy. So
That's right.
is he really playing a game of just getting the American people, the side that was really upset? Even the Democratic side with Sanders, there was a lot of disgruntled people in different ways. Is he venting this and eventually they're going to take him down? Or, because in essence, the Republican Party is the party that's been identified as the party that leans to the Illuminati more than the Democrats. But if you're going to try to crush the Democratic Party, which they're doing a lot of things right now, in my opinion, to have that happen, then you'd almost have to support Trump, wouldn't you? Even if you didn't like that he wouldn't play ball all the time. So what's your opinion on what he's doing so far? I know
Well,
he's done what he said he would, but
yeah.
what's the effect of what he's done that will lead to the future here of the Illuminati or the New World Order?
Well, we don't know that yet is the problem, and there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes that's not getting reported on. John, you and I and Linda, we're all at the mercy of the mainstream media. If they don't carry any of the information, we don't have it. All right. And then there's stuff busting out all over the place, but it's in a little here and a little there and a little there. So we don't have the whole picture. We don't understand what's truly going on. That's why we're here today. We're trying to figure out how this works. Now, let me say this. Donald Trump is not a babe in the woods. Okay, he's been in construction in New York City. Now build things in New York City unless you know how to handle corruption and bureaucracy and the mafia. Okay, you got to play ball with all these guys to get anything done. And so I'm sure he's done his fair share. But now, does that make him a voting member of the club? Not necessarily. Okay, so it could be that he's simply playing his little shell game right now, shuffling things around, trying to get people in position so that he can actually affect some of the basic changes that he campaigned about. Okay, but we don't know this. We don't know. So and his appointments so far have been kind of a mixed bag, haven't they?
Right, but has he done anything right now at all based on what he campaigned on, the angle?
Well, he
The
said he
American.
was going to curtail immigration, and he's doing that with those 7 countries. Which, by the way, let's not fall for the idea that he's trying to ban Muslims. Okay, there's only 7 countries that he's talking about, and these are the ones that have definitely got jihadist and fundamentalist terrorists involved in their country, and it's only prudent that we take a second look at some of the so-called refugees from these people. But now we got all these other Muslim countries, and they're not on that list. So let's don't think he's already being tarred with the idea that he's trying to exclude Muslims, and that's simply not correct. and then so much of what has been critical of him has proved out not to be correct. They had a 10-year-old tape recording of him talking with a bunch of guys joking around, and said, yeah, maybe we could touch the women's private parts if you're rich and famous, and that's about all he said. He didn't say he did it, and yet to this day there is still some media that is claiming that he gropes women's crotches. It's just not right. There's just a lot of lies out there and a lot of misunderstandings. So I think we just have to keep balanced here and watch what's happening. For instance, putting John Bannon in, he's getting his loyalists around him so he can get something done. This is nothing new. John Kennedy caught a lot of flack for making his brother Robert Kennedy Attorney General of the United States. Now, that's pretty obvious nepotism. But yet they did a lot of good in breaking the back of organized crime. So I don't know. We just have
right,
to
right. But I think it's what I'm trying to sum up to you, just based on you followed the world, past the present, future, even present and future. Okay, what he's doing is not what the Illuminatis want, correct?
It would appear not.
Okay,
but then keep in mind though, their basic goal is to create chaos so that they can bring order. Well,
so that's my next question:
they have to create chaos,
right? And that's my next question: is he just there, and he really believes himself that he can do this because, like you said, he's a New Yorker, he's dealt with all these people in building and everything else. So is he just there, into the means where we're going to let him come in here, and we know chaos is going to happen, but eventually when it's time, he will be eliminated because he really does believe he wants to do what he said he did. He's a man of, as far as if he says he's going to do it, he's going to do it. So they create this massive chaos, and then they get rid of him and they put who they really want in there, which a lot of people are scared of Pence. But then my other question would be, leading to this point, because Hillary was supposedly the president of disclosure. They were saying she was going to try. Would this not be the opportunity then to mass chaos, everybody turning against each other? We're going to go back to nationalism more, and then all of a sudden drop sometime in a few months that we're not alone, which would lead actually to where they really wanted a one world order.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a real danger. I think the real danger is the fact that the world economy, and especially the United States economy, seems to be booming, but it's just ballooning is what it's doing. And we're going right back into the same situation we had before 2008 and before 1929. And so what I see is that the sword of Damocles that they're hanging over Trump is the fact that no matter what Trump does, at any given moment, they can pull the plug on the economy and come on TV and say, there's a little bit of a banking crisis. And so for the weekend, we're going to have a bank holiday. No ATMs are going to be operating. No check cash is. No banks opening until next week, and then everything will be okay. Well, that's just a couple of few days. And yet, if something like that should happen, you could see where it could tumble into chaos immediately, because people would rush to the ATMs. They'd run out of money, try to go to the bank to get your money out. The bank's closed. You can't get your money out. The merchants get jumpy and won't take your plastic card. They want real money. It could get real ugly real quick, and they could do this with the flip of a switch.
Right.
And that's so what concerns me. Danger.
That's what concerns me, Jim, is because people think that we still have power. Okay, and in essence, I guess we can go out there and wave our signs, jump up, down, and scream, but ultimately, we are so now tied to money that if all they'd have to do is pull the money out, never mind turn the power off.
Right.
Or restrict the food supply, which they could do. They can make up all kinds of excuses. It's been contaminated, the water's been contaminated. But just the first start would be to pull the money out. But do you think that would be the first step? Because people think that they still really have power, but the people that control the money, which is the corporations and the people that support the corporations, still hold the power. Do you think that would be the way they'd want to go? Or do you think they really do want to? Because that really wouldn't make the world come together. And if their goal is to unite the world, the threat from above, which is that think tank in 98 talked about, first terrorism, then the threat from above. Okay. You have Iron Mountain that talked about that. Would that not be the next step? And do you think that Trump would go along with that? Say if scientists came out like the contact scenario, which is possible now because of what's been in the news, we may have identified a message from out there in space that's aliens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think Trump would go along with that? And do you think that would be beneficial and unite the world? Or would it just be their next step to make a one world order and control everything more?
Well, you mentioned the report from Iron Mountain, which I studied quite at length. In fact, I have an original copy of the original publication, and I guarantee it's not a satire. They are actually trying to figure out what they're going to do if peace should break out, and because they said war is the fundamental building block and foundation for every government. All right, and sure enough, in the United States, for example, the United States Constitution only gives the federal government two powers: one, to coin and regulate money; two, to provide for the common defense. And it's to provide for the common defense that's been their wedge, their foot in the door for everything that's going on. Everything today is national security, national security. Okay, in fact, they've built an entire national security state out of the idea that they have to defend us. Okay, so they, in their report back in 1962, when they were trying to figure out what happens if we have the Cold War ends and we have peace, and they realized that there would be more problems. So they were talking about substitutions for war, and one of them was the space program. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is as far back as 1962, they were thinking and predicting that perhaps what they need to do is have a threat from space, just like was verbalized by President Ronald Reagan in front of the United Nations. You know, he says, what if we had a threat from space? And all the nations banded together. So,
well, do you think it would work? I guess based on your study of the Anunnaki, if they're coming back and all this, would this really work? Would they be able to stabilize the world? Obviously under their control, though. That's the key. They can't have the world out of control. I know it would probably, or in your opinion, would it lead to chaos at first? Because like that's what Robert Bigelow said a few years ago. He said, we're going to get confirmation. Confirmation is there's something there, but we're not going to go into great detail. And then we're going to move forward. So if they announce, let's just say this summer, they came out and said, noticeably there's some signs that's going on. First, they did a mainstream article and said the aliens were probably here, but they're not here anymore. Then they said, well, there was a paper written by those professors. Well, yes, there's probably more than likely, and we want peer reviewed this paper, and we're going to look at this further, but there's a really good chance that was a communication from somewhere else. Okay. Then you have the Chinese who have now launched a quantum satellite, but there's no information on what we have. And they've also now about to put a quantum supercomputer online. And all that would lead to communications. So do you think they're going to try to control and unite the world peacefully without pulling the money out and everything else? Or do you think they might try to just take us all down and then bring the threat?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a little of both. That's the whole problem they have. See, they have their wealth and power today because of their ownership of monopolies in energy and telecommunications and pharmaceuticals. And so, you know, they're not stupid. I don't think they're not really, they don't really want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Okay. But so they're playing a very, very dangerous game because they're trying to bring just enough chaos where they can shepherd people into their new world order, but without bringing down all of the systems, although they could. And I think that's going to be a last resort. If it looks like they're losing their grip and that they're not going to get their new world order, they're not going to just play nice and say, oh, well, okay, you guys win, we lost, you can see what's happening right now with these idiots that, can't accept an election. So they're crying and they're jumping up and down and they're burning their grocery store. What? So yes, I think that if it gets to that point and it looks like they're going to lose, they'll pull the plug on the economy and
Okay.
create
So,
all kinds of chaos. But now whether Trump personally would go along with all that is a whole different question.
Jim, couldn't it be argued that the Illuminati and all of those bloodlines back to the Anunnaki thousands of years ago and up to the present day, that their effort to do a new world order to counter all of the violence and the wars of Homo sapiens sapien could actually be the right path, and that we're not understanding?
Okay, well, first off, all of the wars and the genocides and the regional conflicts that we've seen over the past 70 years, say, is their creation. All right. So don't look to them for the answer. They're the ones that's created the situation that we're in now. And I think they're playing with fire and they know it, and that's why they have to be very cautious in how they do all this. And John was saying, that are they going to just lead us into it? Quietly, well, this is what they've been doing up till now. They've been, pushing the United Nations here, the Club of Rome there, Agenda 21 here, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all these trade agreements, just every little thing, they've just been hammering away at United States sovereignty and prosperity for a good number of years now. And finally, it's gotten to the point where we see that the great mass of people finally now have spoken out and said, no, we don't want to go this way. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Well,
But go ahead.
I was going to say, okay, let's say, for example, the 20-year anniversary is contact this summer, and they were going to announce there's a threat from above. I don't think, no matter what they did, even if their final goal was to unite the world, at first the countries all would race to see who could control the new. They want to be the country of control. We're going to
Yeah.
be the one that the aliens want to come to, or whatever they are, come to. So in that point, maybe we're securing our borders, and because we have the resources that we have all the resources where there's very few other countries in the world that can self-sustain themselves. You know what I mean? For a
Right.
long period of time. So
Right.
maybe we are drawing back and reinventing the United States so that we would be the leader. In fact, if this is not all a cover up and a makeup, or we've known about this for a long time, so we would be the dominating nation to lead the United Nations with whatever is contacted us, and we still would be the controlling factor at the end. I mean, do you
Yeah.
believe the Illuminatis want this country to control things, or is there another country they want to step up and control all this if it took place?
Well, personally, I think the game plan was pretty well outlined back in 1948 by British socialists who I think had contact with the aristocracy in Britain, knew what the game plan was, and he wrote a book called 1984 using the pen name George Orwell. And in there, if you go back and reread 1984, which I always thought would be happening by 1984, it turns out it's on into 2017, and they're still trying to put it together. But John, what they said there, what Orwell predicted was three economic blocks in the world. In the book, it was Asiana, East Asiana, and Asiana. Okay, so but in the real world today, we got the European Union, and they've been pushing for a North American Union. South American Union's already there, and then it would be easy enough to form an Asian Union because you just take those pyramid societies where one person or a clique of people at the top run everything, and you bring them on board or buy them out, and now you've got the Asian Union. And I think that's the idea. And what you do is these three economic blocks play off against each other. They're constantly in conflict with one or the other, and then when peace breaks out, they turn around and now there's a problem with the other block, and they keep that going for the tension that's necessary to keep the profits going and the economy's rolling. And I think that's what's going. Now, let me say this may blow you away. Philosophically, I am not opposed to a one world government or a one world economy. Okay. Obviously, we're all humans and we all occupy this one small dirt ball on the out fringes of the Milky Way galaxy. In fact, I can see in the not too distant future, somebody's going to ask you, where are you from? You're going to say, I'm from Earth. Okay, so we all are earthers, and we all, the difference is this. If we're going to go to a one world government, one world economy, all right, where it's going to require central administration, central authority to make any kind of social program work efficiently, all right? And so they have been trying to push us into this so they can control the central authority and therefore control the world. This is what I'm opposed to, is not the end result, but their methods. They are twisting us every which way, keeping us fearful over terrorism, keeping us dulled down and dumbed down because of bad substances in our food and in our air and in our water and in our vaccines, and so that they can lord us over and force us into their version of a new world order. That's what I'm opposed to.
I understand. And on that note, we're due for our first break, so we'll be right back, folks.
That wraps up the first hour of tonight's interview with our very special guest, Jim Marrs. To find the latest on Jim, visit his website at jimmarrs.com, and that's with 2 R's, jimmarrs.com. Stay right there as we begin hour 2 of tonight's program right after these messages from your choice for UFO Paranormal Talk Radio on the World Wide Web. We're KGRAradio.com. We'll be right back.
Did you know 40% of all cancer could be prevented? That's a fact. Along with maintaining appropriate body weight and regular exercise, the American Institute for Cancer Research and the USDA confirm that eating 9 to 11 servings of fruits and vegetables every day is the key. Now ask yourself, am I at risk? How many servings of fruits and vegetables did I eat today? Balance of Nature has solved this problem and provides an easy and affordable way to consume over 10 servings of 31 different whole fruits and vegetables every day.
Call now to find out how to get your free month's supply of Balance of Nature. Call 800-2468-751. That's 800-2468-751. Call now, 800-2468-751. Or go online to balanceofnature.com.
Use promo code TSL.
The healing powers of silver, Ion Silver, an antiseptic powerhouse used for centuries. Now you can harness the benefits of Ion Silver in a convenient spray. Ion Silver is a highly effective antimicrobial spray that's safe for family and pets. Excellent for wound care, a must for your first aid kit. It binds to bacteria, viruses, and fungus to immediately destroy them. Also used as an underarm deodorant, acne preventative, surface disinfectant, and more. Buy Ion Silver at ionsilver.us. That's ionsilver.us.
Your best source for live UFO Paranormal Talk Radio. KGRAradio.com.
You're listening to the KGRA digital broadcasting station, Van Buren, Arkansas, Salt Lake City, Utah. As we begin hour 2 of tonight's interview with Jim Marrs on Phenomenon Radio, here's Linda Moulton Howe with the news brought to you by earthfiles.com.
More than 150 persistent, unexplained area light flashes and booms have been reported to police, 911, and media in New Orleans, Louisiana since December 2016 and ongoing to date. One New Orleans resident, Tori Godby, told the local Channel 4 WWL-TV, quote, "How is it nobody has seen anything other than the flashes of light and heard the booms? It's more than just curious. Is something going on? I did hear booms on Friday, January 27th, 2017, around 9 to 9:30 p.m., I think it was, and this was the loudest ones I've ever heard, close quote. Another New Orleans resident, Karen Schust, told WWL-TV, quote, "There's no sound like it. All of a sudden, it's this huge explosion, and you have to do a double take, and like, my dog freaks out completely," close quote. In other boom cases around North America since January 2011, 6 years ago, dogs that can hear higher frequencies than humans have often been the first to react by barking, scratching walls, or running scared under beds before the humans in the house finally hear the big booms that shake foundations and have even cracked some cement sidewalks. But the source of this persistent phenomena, we'll call it, of loud booms since 2011 have also been reported in Europe, Central and South America, and Australia, and the source is still unknown. Other regions experiencing loud, unexplained booms recently are San Diego and Alhambra, California. San Diego resident Laura Reynolds told Fox 5 TV News, quote, "I automatically thought it was an earthquake as my car started moving back and forth in Imperial Beach," close quote. And in Alhambra, 125 miles northwest of San Diego, another woman said she heard a loud booming sound at the same time she saw a flash of light. But military and airport officials have denied being responsible for the many very loud ground-shaking booms that sometimes people see light flashes with, and seismologists do not find earthquake activity in the regions at the times that citizens are reporting these persistent and weird booms. One man in New Orleans who wanted to remain anonymous told WWL-TV, quote, "The authorities have got to figure out what this is. This has got to be escalated in the investigations at this point," close quote. And the federal government remains silent. If any phenomenon radio listeners have experienced the loud, unexplained, house-shaking booms themselves or have any information about them where you live, please email me at earthfiles@earthfiles.com. I always honor all requests for anonymity. This is Linda Moulton Howe. Please stay tuned to Earth Files news updates on KGRA radio and visit every day my science, environment, and real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com, for more on breaking stories about our universe, the solar system, and the planet we live on.
And that's the news, brought to you by earthfiles.com. Now back to the program.
Jim, coming back with the idea that we are discussing the link between the ancient past and the current large geopolitical territorial conflicts of this current Earth landscape. What I'm wondering about is in the famous 1980s book, it was a huge bestseller called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. In the back footnotes about Merovingians, there is an actual statement that the Merovingians were considered to be extraterrestrials in Mesopotamia, that the bloodline came from the Merovingians there to France, and that there is a link between France, the Rothschilds, Hitler, and perhaps even World War II, and right now today with the revolution that seems to be taking hold of this planet. Could you dive into that Merovingian ET connection and from the past to the present?
Well, again, and that comes back to having traveled to Rennes-le-Château and southern France. I picked up a bunch of the stories and just, narratives over there. And according to the people there, after following the crucifixion of Christ, his wife, Mary Magdalene, and his children fled and came to southern France. And this is where they grew up, and then they had families. And this is where the bloodline of the Davidic bloodline, meaning from David, has followed all the way down through to the Merovingians, who were then overthrown, and usurpers took their place on the thrones of Europe. The Merovingians were known as the spiritual kings. Okay, they were there to look out for the people who took over, the people who are now the families that now run Europe. These are Johnny come latelys. These are ones who came along and just said, I'm going to take this. So there's where the bloodline still flows through there. And there's a whole interesting thing there showing the interconnectedness between these bloodlines in the European nobility. And again, then that leads us up to the Illuminati, which were a lot of their members probably were of these bloodlines. And this takes us to Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which essentially, as I recall, they were talking about this great secret. And then they got into the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, which is a small French village up on a little mountaintop there. And the village priest suddenly became very wealthy and very well known.
Jim, just explain second that from the air is this massive 5-pointed star.
Yes, the Temple of Isis. Yeah.
Okay, and how does the Merovingian, that big 5-pointed star that's clear in the landscape, tie into the ETs, the Rothschilds, who have controlled the barter system in Europe, and Hitler, and what you found out about all of that?
Well, because it's the bloodlines that are being followed, okay? The Rothschilds, for example, who most people who studied world finances will tell you they're at the pretty close to the top of the food chain on this planet today, and they themselves claim to be the descendants of Nimrod, the ancient Sumerian god king, who said his mother was a human, but his father was one of the Anunnaki, which of course has been translated as one of the gods, but they never actually referred to him as gods. They just referred to him as these folks, these Anunnaki. Okay, and you can come down, you can trace down through the Caesars of Rome and through all the way through to the royalty of England. By the way, most people don't know this, but both the Bush family, the Clinton family, and the Obama family are connected genealogically to the Windsors, the royal family of England. So this is all the same bloodline, and it's come down through the centuries, being passed from one generation to another. And this is why we need to quit paying so much attention to the dog and pony shows that we get and known as presidential elections, and pay closer attention to the families and the bloodlines who are trying to rule over us.
And Jim, who do you think put that massive 5-pointed star right into the landscape around Rennes-le-Château?
Well, it's kind of like the Nazca plains. Yeah, you can't even know that's there unless you get high up in the atmosphere to be able to look down and see it. So, I think that that's evidence, just more evidence that in the past we've had people who were able to take to the skies and were instructing us on how to build some of these incredible artifices.
Why 5-pointed versus 6-pointed or 8-pointed?
Well, the 5-pointed star, of course, is traditionally in occultism signifies Behemoth or Lucifer, the light giver, and that gets into some really weird psychological and type of philosophies, some of which compete with each other, and some of which are pretty consistent with each other. It's you have to just get really deep into that.
But what about Hitler and the Rothschilds?
Well, that's what's interesting here is how did somebody like Hitler, who just came from basically a nothing background, and suddenly becomes the head of a cultured and advanced society. And according to a wartime report made for the OSS here in the United States by Dr. Walter Langer, he said, according to police reports, then available, no longer available, but then available in Vienna, that Hitler's father was the illegitimate son of his mother, who at the time was working as a housemaid in the home of Solomon Rothschild in Vienna. And one of Rothschild's relatives has stated that he was well known for jumping the chambermaids. Okay, so there's all the reason in the world to believe that Hitler's grandmother, is that right, became pregnant with Hitler's father. Okay, and therefore he was 1/4 Jewish, and not only Jewish, but connected to the Rothschilds, and that's why they put him into power, thinking they would be able to control him. But once he got into power, he didn't borrow money from them like he was supposed to. He created his own money, the Reichsmark, and put German people back to work building roads and highways and runways and all kinds of stuff. And yes, started rearming the nation. And by 1936, at the time of the Berlin Olympics, Germany was the economic powerhouse of the world. And in fact, Winston Churchill said that the struggle was not against Hitler or even against National Socialism. It was against the economic might of the German people. They didn't want them, as John mentioned earlier, the center of Western fiscal control is in the city of London, the banks there in London, and they didn't want that power to be turned over to the Germans. And that's what World War II was all about.
And isn't it true that Prescott Bush, the two presidents, George Bush's father and George Bush W's grandfather, was actively involved in the barter system of making money in the German system while we were declaring war?
Well, that's true. In fact, he was prosecuted in late 1942, halfway through the war, as being nothing but a financial front man for Hitler and the Nazis. He was stripped of his holdings in Union Banking Corporation that had been loaning a lot of money to the German government. And he was also stripped, I think, of his board membership in the America Hamburg steamship line, which was the primary vehicle for bringing Nazi saboteurs and money and propaganda into the United States before and during the war.
And Jim, when you look at what Hitler was trying to do in Germany, and that at Peenemünde, there were the silver discs that MI6 had observed all the way back into the 1920s. So the Western world knew that something was happening in Germany that involved silver discs coming up out of Peenemünde, according to people who have worked in our own government. So there is that strange cross-section of a man who seems to be stirring up the economy to be good for the everyman, and bridging it with a super weapon that is coming from, what did they say? ETs from some other solar system. And we end up in this war. And people have said to me, if Hitler was the bloodline of the Rothschilds that go through the Merovingians back to Mesopotamia and to the Anunnaki, why wouldn't Hitler have prevailed in World War II instead of the West?
Well, because they couldn't control him. See, they'd had this was the second great defeat they'd had in trying to set up their new world government, the new world order. At the time of World War I, they were the ones behind the Russian Revolution. And it's the same bunch. In fact, the Illuminati, when they were outlawed and scattered, a bunch of them got together and formed the League of the Just. Okay, and the League of the Just eventually changed their name to the Communist Party. So they created communism. All right, the Wall Street bankers, such as Jacob Schiff, sent ponderous amounts of money over to Russia at the time of the revolution, but it didn't go to the Kerensky government or the White Russians. It went to the Bolsheviks, the communists. All right, so we created communism in Russia, and I think the idea was to set off a early day Cold War between a socialist East and a capitalist West. Okay, but what happened is that they lost control of that because when Lenin died and Stalin took over, then Stalin's the strong man, and he approved of the Internationale. In other words, they were trying to spread communism worldwide. Workers of the world unite. Okay, well, whoa, that's not what these rich plutocratic financiers, bankers, and industrialists, that's not what they wanted. So they had to quickly look around to find somebody who could provide a block against the spread of Russian communism. And they found that with their Rothschild-connected private in the German army, Adolf Hitler. And so they backed him and they created National Socialism. Notice it's still socialism, okay? But this was National Socialism, so they could try to keep it confined to one national boundary and not have workers of the world unite. and what happened was, as I just mentioned, Hitler just didn't play ball with them. He didn't borrow money from the bankers to be under their control. He created his own money, and that's what they had to put a stop to because they didn't want all the other nations, like the United States, to realize that if we printed our own money and loaned it to ourselves, we wouldn't charge interest on it, and we wouldn't be $20 trillion in debt.
Well, Jim, why was Hitler obsessed and said in statements to the public, to large crowds, that he was going to place tall, blonde, blue-eyed, perfect Aryan humans in control of the earth?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure there's a positive answer, but I think you and I both suspect that he, or at least some of his close loyalists, were in touch with these tall, blonde Aryans. And I think they were being told that, hey, you guys are doing good. You guys ought to be running the world, and we'll help you. Okay. And that's why all of a sudden the Nazis were able to come up with such incredible super weapons and technology that far outstripped anything we had in the West. Okay. But I think that what happened there is as the war grew on and grew uglier, I think these non-humans took a look and said, wait a minute, these Nazis look good on the surface. They all wear snappy uniforms and they march down the road to the band music, and they're looking good, looking like the wave of tomorrow. But wait a minute, look here, look at these concentration camps, and look at the millions that are suffering on the battlefronts, and this is just not a good thing. And I think that they withdrew their support from Nazi Germany, and that's why that towards the end of the war they were coming out with incredible weapons that probably could have changed the course of the war, like atomic weapons, jet fighters, things like that, guided missiles, cruise missiles. Okay, but it was too little, too late, and the 26 nations were able to overcome the military of Nazi Germany and put a stop to the war. Now, the German military surrendered, but the Nazis, the National Socialists, never surrendered. They were never at the surrender table. They never surrendered, and they just moved. And a lot of them came over to the United States.
And Jim, I've been told that what is behind the matrix of World War II, this was the sentence given to me by a Defense Intelligence Agency retiree in 1999, World War II was an extraterrestrial war fought through human body containers, and that the point that was made to me was that the reason that Hitler and the tall blondes did not prevail on this planet was because the Ebens, the pear-shaped headed extraterrestrial biological entities that approached our government and apparently were working behind the scenes with the Western allies, that this was a war between gray Ebens and the tall blondes, and the gray Ebens won.
Well, that certainly would have been nothing new, because if you go back and reread the Old Testament, you'll find that at the first half of the Old Testament, it's nothing but one war after another between these kings over there in the Middle East. And I think what was happening there is that the wars were started, generated, and manipulated by these Anunnaki. And sometimes they were fighting amongst themselves over territory, over power, over who's going to be king here, who's going to be king there. And as they would have these wars, of course, they didn't want to go and dirty their hands by fighting. So they had their human hybrids or their human followers, and they created their armies, and these armies would go out and fight each other. And every time, if you and I are an Anunnaki and we had some kind of a problem, some kind of issue that we wanted to resolve, well, then I'd send my army out, you'd send your army out, and we'd decide the issue on the battlefield, which was kind of an elaborate way of throwing the dice, but it certainly kept the human population in check, and it kept everybody in harness and, being good soldiers, obeying orders. And that translates all the way down to today. You ask the average fighting man in World War II, or even today over in Afghanistan, what are you fighting for? They're going to have a hard time coming up with an answer.
Well, Jim, does it mean that the Ebens are the ones that now control and influence the 1% of this planet and not the tall blondes?
Well, that's entirely possible, but I'm not sure how you could prove that. Knowing these things and proving these things are entirely different things.
Well, in terms of a control system, it may be that it is a three-way geopolitical territorial conflict.
Well, maybe even 4 or 5 ways. We don't know we don't have a reliable player list, to know who the players are. And I think that's another reason for the general secrecy that's going on today, is that even the participants aren't sure who's in the game and what their allegiances are.
Well, Trump goes back to Ireland and Western Europe, is blonde and blue-eyed. Do you think that the Windsor bloodline that seems to have possibly a link to the Merovingians back to Mesopotamia, that we could tell the players a bit about their bloodline?
Well, yeah, except the problem is, look at Hitler. He was short and dark-haired. He didn't look like an Aryan. And the same thing. And then when you go and you begin to understand how these bloodlines have procreated themselves down through the centuries, it's not always been through husband, wife, and children. It's been through concubines and through, just girls on the side. In fact, they seem to have a penchant for going out and impregnating just any wide variety of women out there, just to keep going. And then from among these that are these half breeds, I guess you could call them, they are able to pick the best and the brightest, and then they put them into positions of power, like Barack Hussein Obama and Bill Clinton. Okay. And, but so they have just enough control over them, and yet they're not actually one of them. And so I'm not sure that you could actually make any clear determinations by simply looking at the physiognomy of some of these rulers.
Well, you wrote a book called The Rise of the Fourth Reich in America, our country. Mm-hmm. After this next break, could you come back and address that from this shakeup in the United States and England of what is happening now, and whether or not you think forces are trying to counter the rise of the Reich Nazism in the West?
I think that's exactly what's going on, and yes, we'll talk about that.
To find the latest on the Phenomenon Radio Show, log on to the website phenomenonradio.com. And for the latest in science, the environment, and real X-Files, visit the award-winning website earthfiles.com with over 2,000 in-depth reports that go way beyond the 6 o'clock news. That's earthfiles.com. We'll be right back for the final segment of tonight's program on the best choice for alternative talk radio on the planet. This is KGRAradio.com. Don't go anywhere.
Would odors, mold, and mildew describe your basement or crawl space? It doesn't have to be that way. Transform them into a fresh, healthy, usable one with the technologically advanced Wave moisture control units. The computerized operation maximizes moisture control and also expels harmful radon, combustion gases, and numerous other pollutants. Dehumidifiers are old technology that do nothing for air quality and waste energy. Wave units are intelligent, self-monitoring, do not need maintenance, and will save you hundreds in electricity. Wave units are still running effectively over 15 years. They've been tested and installed in public and military housing and by property managers nationwide. Buy a unit now, and if your home is not fresher and drier, you can return it for a full refund for up to 12 months. What have you got to lose? Call now. 1-888-618-WAVE. 1-888-618-WAVE. Or visit mydryhome.com. That's mydryhome.com.
Wave Home Solutions for a healthy, comfortable home.
PatriotPrepared.com carries the leading brands of storable food from Numana, Legacy, and Heaven's Harvest. Patriot Prepared. Our name says it all. We're dedicated to empowering you to be self-reliant and confident in any circumstance. Whether you want to be prepared in the event of an emergency or you're an outdoor sports enthusiast, PatriotPrepared.com has prepackaged meals and kits for your entire family. Legacy, Heaven's Harvest, and Numana are known for high-quality, great-tasting GMO-free, nutritious food with no chemical preservatives. Simple to prepare, easy to store, gluten-free and organic high-quality nutrition options with a 25-year shelf life. You can't beat the feeling of being food secure when you need it most. So go to PatriotPrepared.com right now to pick up your supply of high-quality storable food for your family, because it makes good sense to be prepared. That's PatriotPrepared.com.
For the thousands of wounded warriors returning from battle, Wounded Warrior Project has developed the Warriors to Work program, a career counseling service that helps wounded warriors translate their military experience to a civilian job. These extraordinary men and women bring more than just teamwork and inspiration to the workplace. They bring proven world-class job skills. And to ensure proper placement, Wounded Warrior Project works with employers to find just the right job fit. Talented, skilled, and eager to get back to work, you have the opportunity to hire a seasoned veteran. Contact Wounded Warrior Project at findwwp.org. Welcome home, the brave.
Always on the edge of the hottest alternative talk.
No way you could keep a secret as big as covering up a UFO. Is this how evidence is suppressed?
Always has been. Always will be. KGRA, the planet.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. We are about to begin the final segment of Phenomenon Radio Live tonight with very special guest, Jim Marrs.
Before the break, Jim, I was asking you about this whole issue that if we have a geopolitical territorial landscape now that seems to be politically revolutionary, United States, England, and other countries, could it be that something is now trying to influence humans to counter the rise of the Fourth Reich, as you wrote, in the United States?
Well, it would certainly appear to be that way. If not in reality. See, you have to understand that at the end of World War II there in Europe, we defeated the German Wehrmacht, the military. and that's who the generals there to sign the surrender. See, but nobody representing the Nazi Party was at that surrender. The Nazis never surrendered; they just went on. And since they had had such great support building up there in Germany before the war, with help from the Bank of England and from Wall Street, they still had those contacts, and they simply moved. And a lot of them went to Egypt. A lot of them went to Argentina, South America. A lot of them actually came straight to the United States, thanks to John J. McCloy, who, as director of Citibank during the 1930s, had been the top lender of money to Nazi Germany. And then he became the High Commissioner at the end of World War II and was assigned, he was the one who designated who gets to come to the United States. And once they got over here, their backgrounds were whitewashed of their Nazi connections by his protege, Allen Dulles, who by say 1950, had become head of the CIA. And so this is where they were rolled into our military industrial complex. And we got the benefit of some of their technology, like their jet fighters and their rockets and their mind control experts. But unfortunately, we also picked up some of their philosophy. And that's why that this country, ever since the coup of 1963, has been moving more and more into a fascist type police state. Because this is who the mentality of the people who were rolled in under Operation Paperclip, where they brought in all these unreconstructed Nazis and put them in charge of various aspects of our military-industrial complex. And yes, today I think that, they have crept along. I forget who it was. I think it was a politician in Louisiana who once said, if fascism comes to the United States, it will come carrying the American flag. And that meaning that we would allow fascism and Nazism to gain control over our mechanisms in this country. And I think this, to a large extent, is indeed what's happened. Because first off, you go back and you realize that fascism is a term that is attributed to the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini during World War II, and because of his black-shirted fascistas, so they call him fascist. And but Mussolini himself said that fascism probably wasn't the really correct term. He said the more correct term was corporatism, ruled by the corporations. And I submit to you that that's exactly what we find ourselves in the United States today. And we're in corporatism. We're being run by the corporations. And in fact, the very dictionary definition of fascism is the combining of state and corporate power. So here we are. And so I think this past election, I think the Brexit vote in the UK, I think this shows that a great majority of people have begun to wake up to the fact that these fascist elements have been burrowing their way into our society and trying to create this fascist state. And yes, I think what we're seeing now is a ground root struggle between those who want further central control and the new world order of a one world socialist government, as opposed to people who are now waking up and deciding that they would like to err on the side of individual freedom and democracy.
There's a interesting show that just came out on Sci-Fi, and it kind of covers that, except what happens is, I think it's based on 10, 15 years from now, where it's on Thursday nights, where actually our governments collapse, especially at least in the United States, and zones are taken over by corporations. And if you work for that corporation or that conglomerate of companies, you're inside the green zone, you're protected, and then you can rise through the ranks possibly, but there's a tier just like everywhere else. But then there's the outside wall where everyone else is left to fend for themselves. But do you think that's what they want? That was kind of my question in the first hour. Do they really want that, or do they want the world to unite together and form, like in Star Trek, a federation, still being under control and manipulation. And then also, I know your book covered this, and they just had a very fascinating series on the History Channel showing that Hitler didn't die, but was either allowed to escape or escaped. But even if he wasn't allowed, they had to realize sooner than later he was down in South America. So is that what they want? Because they've kept that bloodline going in the people down there, that eventually they're going to interfuse that again, but this time hopefully they'll have more control over it, over the way it ended up last time, because Hitler, like a lot of people, thought he was could rise above all of them and take complete control himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have to watch for a rehabilitation of Hitler. It's going to be tough because of 70 years of hard propaganda. You know, he's the worst thing to ever walk the face of the earth. And so it's going to be tough and slow, but I think eventually, maybe within our lifetimes, you'll be hearing people. I mean, you can see the resurgence of right-wing extremism in Europe today, thanks to the illegal immigration programs that they've initiated over there. So, yes, I think that we're seeing now a resistance to this growing fascism. And the thing is, it's Illuminism, okay? This fascism is not, you can't relegate it to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It's elements within both of them. All right. So we have to quit allowing ourselves to be broken into this manipulated conflict between conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats, because it's not that clear cut. And the thing we have to be on guard from is these Illuminati, or these Illuminized individuals who are not, again, they're not going to be carrying a card that says I'm a member of the Illuminati, but they are going to be doing things that will interfere with the process of a free and democratic people, and will try to move us into a more autocratic, plutocratic society where, you know, the rich guy tells you what to do and you just do it. In fact, John, I was thinking there a minute ago when you're talking about today with the people in power and the head of the corporations that are making decisions for us. And I was just thinking, how is that the corporation running our life? How much different is that from the king determining what your life's going to be? Okay. In feudal times, the king owned everything. You were just a tenant on the land, you know, trying to eke out enough vegetables and produce to feed yourself. And then today, you know, you're on food stamps and you're on subsidized housing, but you still, even if you try to own something, you don't own it, because then they'll come and tell you have to pay taxes. And if you don't pay the taxes, then they'll run you off your land. So, you know, I don't see a lot of difference between today and the Middle Ages, except just the techniques of how they were lording over the individual.
Well, not only that, but if people would do their homework, which no one does, they just jump on a bandwagon.
They just watch TV.
Right. I think that's sad. But I was shocked years ago when I worked for American Express, the credit card company, and they had their board of directors meeting, and I was there. Matter of fact, Henry Kissinger was there too. But all of the major powers, the money and the major corporations, were on the board, you know, and the CEO, you know, of American Express, and he sat on all of their boards. So most people, I don't even think can understand that there's a close clique of the major corporations, and they all work together, even though the press leads you to believe they're not. They're actually working together. It's no different than, you know, the Russians are the evil empire, but when I was in the military, there was more than one occasion where I observed the United States and the Russians working closely together on something in the press. They appeared to be fighting against each other. So things aren't what they look like, folks. It seems like
true.
They are.
That is true.
And you need to stop being led around by the nose, because that's what irritates me the most about America today. Somebody will say something, and all of a sudden it goes around the world. And what's that saying? Things can go halfway around the world before a lie can go halfway around the world before somebody can get their pants on. And you know, and if you care about this country and you care about what's going to happen, you got to be educated. And education means you got to take the time to read everything and go back and do some research and understand what's really going on. And I think that's what they don't want. They don't want that. They want us to just be, you know, be little sheeple and pick sides and fight amongst each other. And meanwhile, they just continue to dominate us. And I understand we're different and different people have different views. But again, what made this country great for a while was we were center. And whoever was in charge had a little bit more control than the other, but we stayed to the center. And now it just seems like we either go hard left or hard right all the time. And that's the worst thing that can happen to us. And the people need to wake up and start trying to get along and make their views work together and not fighting each other.
And Jim, if the big box around this planet is geopolitical territorial conflicts between other intelligences that might be the Ebens, the tall blondes, and some sort of reptilian or even insects, what do they want?
Oh, well, they want dominion over the earth. They want to control everything just like everybody does. Some may be more benevolent than others. But I don't think, number one, we've talked about this before, I don't think you have to worry about a armed invasion, you know, where the, you know, like Independence Day, where they flood the sky with saucers and they're blowing up everything, because simply put that if that was the game plan, they certainly could have done it long before now, when we actually have laser weapons and rockets and you know, infrared and things that we could use to fight them with. So that's not the game plan. I think the game plan is to try to, of the various factions trying to vie for leadership over the world, and that would include ETs, and that would include the human factions. The whole thing, what they want is they want control. And to get control generally requires power, which requires wealth. So that's why that the financial system is so inextricably intertwined with the political and governmental systems on this world. And this is what they're trying to get hold of. And they have to do it sub rosa. They can't, you know, the one rule of the game is don't give away the game. And so everybody's trying to play and everybody's trying to get a commanding position in the game, and yet at the same time they're trying not to give the game away. And of course the poor old long-suffering tax-paying public, they're just out there watching TV and having a beer and going to bed, get up, go to work, and come back, do it all over again. So they just don't have the time or the energy to figure out what's truly going on. But we're working on it. We're waking up American zombies one at a time.
Well, Jim, in the conclusion of your new book, Shadows of the Illuminati, you quote Charles Fort from 1919 when he says, "I think we are owned. We are property. The earth is owned." Who would be the owner?
Well, I think that's what they're vying for, and trying to figure out who is going to be the owner. Because as you well know, we got several species operating down here, some in cahoots with governments, some not at all in connection with governments. So I think that's the key thing. That's what's going on, is who is going to take control of the controls.
And what do you think?
Well, I would like to think that we as thinking human beings could cast off all our baggage and all the propaganda that we've been laden with, you know, and say, hey, we want to be free and independent human beings, you know, just leave me alone. And I'd like to see us to regain control over our own world.
And not get down on our knees to extraterrestrials as gods.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not getting on my knees to anybody.
Well, Jim, I got a question for you. When did we ever have control? I mean, really, what time in history did we
probably
have
never.
control? Right, that's what I mean. So why? What's it going to take? And and in all honesty, if it were to try to take place, it would have to be way bigger than, the revolution that happened to form America in the first place. Are people even willing to do that?
Well, that's a good question, too. And actually, there has been a couple of instances in human history when we tried to, excuse me, when we tried to regain our individual freedom and liberty, and that's in early Greece, and then here for 100 years or so in North America, when some very, very smart intellectual people put together a Constitution, a Bill of Rights, a Declaration of Independence that pretty well outlines how a people can be free and operate with each other. I want to guarantee you the problems we have in the United States today are not the result of the Constitution. They are the result of not adhering to the Constitution. It's not because of the Constitution, it's because we're not following the Constitution. And a good example is that Constitution says only 3/4 of Congress must declare war before we can have a war. Well, obviously that's gone by the boards. And yet, if you stop and think about it, if we can't convince 3/4 of Congress that we have to go to war somewhere, we probably don't need to go to war there.
Okay, but you gave an example of the Constitution on that, but okay, the Constitution was written, and now today we've changed. Do you feel the Constitution is, people are saying that we need to adhere to the Constitution, period, that's fair, or does there need to be some changes as we've changed and evolved? And again, that's one of the biggest fights going on right now. It used to be more religion. Now it's about, the Constitution in this country, and the liberals against the Republicans, or, the hard right and the hard left. And I mean, there is a huge population out there that's in the center, that they're not calling themselves independents, but they don't really have a voice other than if Trump is going to be that voice. But I mean, we're brimming on things blowing up. The problem is, unless there was some influence from somewhere else that wanted to help the people that care, I mean, what chance do we have against the people that control the money and control everything?
Well, you just saw we've got a fighting chance. The people, the leadership and the money in Britain said, don't leave the European Union. They voted to do it anyway. Over here, we were told, vote for Hillary. She's going to get it. She's she's a woman and she knows how to do things and she has experience. And no, we're going for that either. So I think people are waking up. And I think that what we have to do is, and I would disagree with you on that. The thing is that the Constitution is old and needs to be changed. No, it doesn't. Human behavior has not changed in 200 years. Okay, technology has changed, so there could be some small tweaking of the Constitution, but then to do any major changes would require a constitutional convention of the states, and we, for God's sakes, we don't want that, okay? Because if you ever did that, the corporations with their deep pockets would come in, pay off, bribe off everybody. They would change the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to where it would be unrecognizable, all right?
Right,
so
and
what
I
we
think
need to do.
Right, and I think that's something people need to wake up, and I'll let you finish, is that that's not happening and isn't going to happen. So therefore, this is just about chaos and making us hate each other. Because if they were serious about this, or do you think they are going to try to do this?
I think that we're going to. There is a very real possibility. Now, keep in mind, see, they can whipsaw us around with false flag attacks and with phony stories and phony and all kinds of things to keep us stirred up. But if enough people would get their head on straight and start understanding the methods that are being used against us to control the population, manipulate the population, then we can simply say no. Not going to do that. Another good example is that one of the most contentious issues in the country today is the issue of abortion. And I got to admit, this is a true controversy because there are equal numbers of thoughtful, concerned, caring, educated people who simply cannot agree on when life begins, when life should end, what's, blah, blah, blah. Now, so there is a genuine controversy, and yet I do not see any reason why there should be any problems with the issue of abortion. If we are a country where we have individual freedom and liberty, then it should be up to the individual, his or her family, his or her doctor, they decide. Okay? And it's like no one should be forced to have an abortion. No one should be forced to not have an abortion. It's called individual freedom. Gee, what a concept. Maybe we could go back to that for a change.
Right. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. I really want to thank you for coming on tonight.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you. We've covered a lot of territory, but just remember things are changing. And don't give me this, I'm one individual, what can I do? The whole history of the world has never been written by a mob or a committee. It's always by some individual, for better, for worse. So get out there and try to shape this country and this society into something a little better than it is now.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
That's going to do it for this edition of Phenomenon Radio Live. Be sure and join us next week for the return of former CNN investigative journalist Chuck DeCaro. For John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, and our very special and honored guest, Jim Mars, I'm Race Hobbs. Thank you all for joining us tonight for another edition of Phenomenon Radio. Be sure and stay right there as Jimmy Church is on deck next for 3 more hours of live programming with Fade to Black. And tonight, it's Fader Night with open lines tonight on the program, and it's all right here exclusively on the KGRA digital broadcast station, your choice for alternative talk radio on the World Wide Web. Have a great night and a great weekend, everybody.